Well, good morning, everyone. We're very pleased to have Miguel with us this morning to talk about equal partnerships and ethical internationalization in higher education. Just a little bit about Miguel. Let me just get the bio here. Miguel is a senior lecturer in education at the Manchester Institute of Education at the University of Manchester. He's co-convener of the International Research Network of the Society for Research into Higher Education. Previously, he's been an EU Marie Curie Fellow at Aarhus University in Denmark and director of the Global Public Policy Network of Sciences of Paris and the London School of Economics. In Southeast Asia, he's been a lead researcher on projects for the EU support to higher education in Asian and the Asia-Europe Foundation, the ASEP, studies for the Asia-Europe meeting in higher education and SDGs. So, without further ado, it's a great pleasure to have Miguel here visiting us in Oise. We are doing this both in person and online, so it's a hybrid arrangement with Aaron masterfully looking after the online version here. So there's a nice little crowd here, and we've got, I think, a larger crowd online. Look forward to participating in this conversation. Just as a reminder that we are recording this, and we will turn off the recording after the presentation to allow for free flow of conversation during a Q&A. Miguel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for that. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you very much for setting up the space. Thank you to Erin and to Gary who set this up. Thank you to Cresso as well, who's put me in touch with quite a few people. Thank you all for coming. I mean, other people could be places to be on a Sunday. Sunny, not Sunday, sunny morning.
Good to hear who was sunny.
On a sunny morning in Toronto. It's good to be back. I see some colleagues whom I saw the last time that I was at Oise in Toronto at a conference. I think that Emma and her colleagues organized here on higher education and I think sustainable futures in higher education. So I'm glad to come here and continue the conversation and continue speaking to colleagues here at Oise. Right, so I think Erin had so generously prepared a poster that actually had the term international student mobility in the title, which I think will still feature in the presentation. I've just come from a conference in a summer institute in Boston, where some people pushed back against kind of limiting conversations about international higher ed, particularly about partnerships to student mobility. So clearly it'll figure today, but I took it to heart and thought about, yeah, that's definitely true. That, I mean, partnerships are more than just about students moving from one country to another or one institution to another. Although I guess it can play a role in how we understand some dynamics in international partnerships between the global north and the global south, or the global east and the global west. So some of these things we'll be talking about in the conversation. So here's the, oops. Oh, there you go. I just need to press a little bit harder. So that was the abstract that I'd sent. And maybe, so part of that kind of like de-emphasis in a way of international student mobility leads us to perhaps emphasize the other bits of the abstract, which is the evolving role of T&HE, of transnational higher education. And I added, this is not in the kind of original abstract, HE policy coordination as part of wider national development policies. And it's not that, I mean, I guess being a small and hopefully kind group and audience today, a conversation among friends, it's not the most elegant story, I would say. I will tell you what could have been the more elegant stories, but I'm here to report on some work that we've done in different projects, different funded projects, and how I wish that kind of you could just get funders to let you do whatever you want. But sometimes, every so often, they say, no, we'd like you to do this and we'd like you to do that. But we've done some significant work on different things. And I was trying to think about like how to put them together. So it might not be the most straightforward story, but hopefully you'll see some of the connections. But it's a way to present to you some work that I and teammates have done on certain things, and to try and come up with a kind of like bigger idea around this idea of ethical partnerships, equal ethical partnerships. Yeah, so we all know how research presentation goes. So just, I mean, I think another thing that's really, really interesting, and I was reflecting on this a little bit more on the previous conference that I was at in Boston, the title of which, or the theme of which, was power and inequality. was I drew on an insight. So they'd asked me to speak about that as well to an audience of mostly at that particular event, early career scholars. And I really felt that it was important to share positionality, and not just that, to share kind of a personal biography and link to the research site and the research topic. I think it's very important for people to know where you are, and I'll tell you why, and also how people struggled or sometimes had affordances that were not available to other people. So many moons ago, but one of my past academic lives was in political science and public policy. And some political scientists, I must say mostly as well in North America, but not only in North America, but some political scientists think that the study of power, of political power, is a quasi-objective science. And the sense is that, like the metaphor being that you come into a room, say with 8 people and now 10 online or whatever it is, and that, if you're a silent observer, if you're a fly on a wall, eventually you will be able to discover objectively who is the most powerful person in the room just by observing who's saying more, who speaks first or last, or this or that. So the sense of like political science being able to come up with a scientific question of what power is and who wields it. And then there's a different perspective, slightly more anthropological, which is that when you come into a room, based on who you are in the room, you might feel your answer to that question of who's the most powerful, who's more or less powerful, might be different. If you were, say, if you look like a man or male or a female, or you had lighter or darker skin, or you wore certain kinds of clothes or not, right? And I subscribe by that, I think. So it's just to say that, well, I'm originally from the Philippines, which is normally considered part of the global South. Not normally, is in the global South. I am sat at the University of Manchester, which, if you believe it's marketing and communications people, is one of the, like super duper global top ranked universities, like changing the world for the better, top in this, top in that. So very much a global North platform. It does have privileges that we notice. One thing on the personal side that I will mention as well, and it's something that I draw like an insight from Raewyn Connell, who, speaking of the global South, is the proponent of Southern theory, the idea that we need to see things from the perspective of the global, of basically using theory, using theories only developed in the global North doesn't always or sometimes misrepresents experiences of people outside the global North, and that there are perspectives outside of the global North that we need to realize. So it's not just the case that if you have a study of, say, French middle-class families and come up with a theory about social capital, that is obviously a statement about humanity or human nature in general. It might apply to many contexts, but it's not necessarily the case. Raewyn Connell, who pushed this idea or this theory, Southern theory, I tell my students that, like I teach about this in a class on international development, and I show them eventually, right, like after a few quotes from Raewyn Connell's work and her book, show them pictures of Raewyn Connell to just like say, okay, like this is it, and ask them whether they notice anything. And I have several pictures of her at different points in time. And most people say, well, she looks like she's a white woman, isn't that? But what most people don't realize, and I tell them later, is that Raewyn Connell started life as a man, right? And had a transition experience, right? Like that she transitioned from being a man to being a woman. And but this is my reading, right? Like I think that transition influences her thinking and has helped her to articulate this sense of, well, you understand the world in a slightly different way, whether you're a man or woman. That long introduction to say is that after having spent almost 15 years now in Britain and having very recently become a British citizen, I realize now, I experience this world of international partnerships, literally these spaces in airports, in immigration queues, in visa, in virtual, because now I don't need to go to physical visa application spaces, but in virtual visa application spaces. The world that I inhabit is a very different world, I think, from the world that I experienced up until fairly recently. So that's a positionality statement that colors my view of ethical or kind of equal international partnerships in higher ed. Obviously, I also have like other experience. I wasn't always a depressed and pessimistic academic. Once upon a time, I was an optimistic professional in international student mobility management, in kind of international higher ed management, among global elite, quote unquote, global north rather, higher education institutions. So that's also partly where some of my previous professional experiences from. I did have also work in the higher education sector in the Philippines that was mostly in performance audit in the higher education sector in the Philippines, but not in international partnerships. So this second context, which is more a thematic context, is things that we all already know, very well covered in the literature. The fact that, oh, okay, internationalization is a thing. But actually, no. Sometimes we probably at OISE or scholars of international higher ed know this, the idea that there is this world-class university discourse. Universities are all trying to be world-class. Many of them are trying to internationalize. Internationalization is often seen as a path to world-classness. This includes many different aspects. For instance, there are, well, that's one element of it. Internationalization also includes, there's a sub-literature on student experiences, student recruitment. There's a sub-literature on pedagogy, it's very much the internationalization of the curriculum literature. Betty Leask, who was at Boston with us, was reflecting on kind of like the growth and the development of that field. There's obviously literature and research collaboration, science diplomacy, et cetera, right? So our discussion will talk mostly about, well, international student mobility as a case study of that, and transnational higher education partnerships. The part that I said, which was slightly inelegant, is that the two research projects that I'm mentioning don't both cover international student mobility. So they're, one of them is about international student mobility and the other is about TNHE policies, right? The elegant version of this story would be both projects would have been about international student mobility or about an analysis of higher ed policy. You'll see what I mean in a short while. There's also global north-south dynamics. So as I said, there are a lot of policies, named policies. For instance, there's the Russian Plan 5100, right? Just easy mnemonic to recognize that the point of the plan is to have 5 Russian universities in the top 100. Obviously, that's very difficult to achieve now because Russia has largely been excluded from most of the global rankings, but it gives you a sense, at least the Russian name, the name of the Russian plan gives you a very clear sense of the spirit of that policy, right? Like 5 in the top 100, right? The other initiatives have slightly more or less precise words, like the Japanese global first. Sorry, that's a Chinese one. The Chinese one is double first class initiative. The Japanese ones have another one with a lot of superlatives in it. But as I said, the Russian one is like 5 universities in the top 100. And there are versions of that throughout the global south. So the general trends of ISM are south to north and east to west. There's also obviously a literature that critiques these flows as being extractive, dealing with international students as cash cows. There's more, I would say, more sympathetic literature to human experiences, some done by some of my colleagues in our research group at Manchester on student experiences, students as being subject to a deficit narrative, that students from the global east come to the global south, sorry, from the global east come to the global west, but they lack global west pedagogical or intellectual characteristics such as critical thinking, refined academic writing and academic expression, and so on and so forth, right? Like, or participative strategies in classrooms. So there's a bit of that, and some of my colleagues have demonstrated that in the academic literature. And then there's marginalization of the global south in international networks and spaces in HE. And I have like personal experience of that. So just as an aside, one of the networks that I worked in, an extremely well-ranked global, an extremely well-ranked non-European, non-American institution had to muscle its way into this partnership, basically on the basis of its like high ranking. The thing is that the sense of it being having to work doubly hard to enter these spaces because it was not a Euro-American institution, but felt it, or obviously it wanted to be in that space. So not just are the normal Global South institutions often marginalized, but even elite Global South institutions can be marginalized in these mostly North Atlantic networks. So the research aims of the projects that I'm presenting today are about studying the differences between foreign and local understandings of partnerships, determining whether there are any understandings of quote unquote equal partnerships, and understanding, or at least promoting it as a kind of research agenda for any of you who might be interested, promoting more interest in studying South-South partnerships, right? So very often when we think of equal partnerships, we're thinking, oh, let's try to make the relationships between the Global North and the Global South more equal. Oh, it's almost automatic that we think of international partnerships in those terms. But what we want to say is that there are South-South partnerships that are emerging. First of all, I think we should consider them as a legitimate research object. And not just that, we should, I guess, like, as there's more academic and professional interest in South-South partnerships, that might of itself lead to more appetite and more infrastructure for those kinds of partnerships to flourish. For this session, though, so apart from the research that I'm presenting, I'd love to learn more about ISM, TNHE in Canada and its role. So one has only, like so many hours in the day. So I've done, as you'll see, like work on Sino-foreign partnerships, work in ASEAN, obviously being based in the UK. I'm a little bit more familiar with the European and British discourse, which are now increasingly diverging. And it would just be great because one is here physically, right? Like, I mean, to learn a little bit more about Canada. That's, I think, why we travel and learn about new places. I want perhaps us to consider the role of Global North institutions, such as the one that we're sat in South-South mobilities and partnerships. The idea that, oh, okay, like even in the Global North, can we play a part in South-South mobilities and South-South partnerships? And I wanted to really, bring these ideas to extend thinking and analysis beyond the kind of basically to get your feedback about the things that I'm presenting today. So to extend kind of like the thinking that I've started doing about institutional partnerships. In other words, beyond thinking about just university to university partnerships, but thinking about region to region partnerships, such as the EU-ASEAN cooperation kind of program that I'll be, that funded one of the projects you'll hear about. So I'll speak about the results of the project, but I'd love to think with you and take a step back to think about the funders of that project, which are the ASEAN Secretariat and the European Union. And then to think about international faculty research or professional staff mobilities, not just ISM. So, okay, onwards. So just some, like conceptual frameworks that I'm drawing upon to kind of organize some of my thinking around this work. So there's a fellow called Jonas Stier, who helps me to think about internationalization in education and particularly instrumental internationalization. I think it's a really good read. The idea that internationalization is an instrument or is a means to an end, I think is the main idea to take away. But Jonas Stier says it, or has a wider framework where he lays that out much more elegantly. So he's a scholar of he's an intercultural studies scholar. In 2004, he described internationalization as a state of things, a process, and a doctrine. I'm particularly interested in the last point, the sense that we have beliefs about internationalization that govern kind of like how we partner or basically how we do things. But I'm particularly interested in the sense of like, we believe things about internationalization, right? So these were kind of like his like doctrines, right? How he basically also described possible doctrines that we can have in internationalization in HE. So, like his isms of internationalization were idealism, that internationalization is good per se, educationalism, that internationalization enriches the overall academic experience of staff, leading to their Bildung or lifelong learning, and instrumentalism, which is internationalization, belief that internationalization is primarily a means to an end. So yeah, like the pessimist in me obviously is drawn to the latter part, right? Like that, like internationalization doesn't really, serve any end apart. As like there's obviously the sense of like, oh, internationalization is good in itself. we should just have more of it, whatever the case, right? Like whatever the price, because it's good. But the kind of slightly more, slightly less rosy picture is that it is a means to an end. So in which case we need to think about whose interests, whose ends are being represented in internationalization, and that there could be many ends, right? And that's one way to complexify the picture. There is, so to the second and the third bullet point. So if you're sympathetic to that view, or if you will entertain the view of like, in my sense, I don't see why not, of internationalization being seen as a means to an end, you could read a number of academic articles about like how internationalization is used in different ways, right? In general and in the context of partnerships. Much of the scholarship on partnerships revolves around the interests of the sender, rather. So like, okay, so one article, for instance, I'm thinking about by a very, very good friend and colleague who works out of Berlin. Well done analysis, but it's really funny, right? Like it's an analysis of the strategy of Britain and Germany, which represent two, these are my words, my terms, my reading of it are varieties of capitalism. So depending on the kind of British variety of capitalism or the like German neo kind of socialist neo ordo-liberal version of capitalism, you have certain versions of internationalization partnership strategies. And he does a very, very good job of explaining how that works based on this precisely this socioeconomic framework of Britain and Germany and how they're different. And you'll see a slightly different example of that. I've compared in some of my work with some of my teammates, Britain and Denmark. And well, Denmark is actually, if ever, an even more quote unquote socialist model of, you know, like socialist kind of like a framework or structure than the Germans, right? But there was never any consideration of, right, like, oh, it's just like, oh, this branch campus operates under these in this way because of Britain, and that branch campus operates that way because of Germany, without any attention to like, where are they operating, right? Is there a possibility that Britain might need to adjust its kind of like extremely neoliberal market-based model because they're operating in Canada or in China or in the Philippines, right? Or Germany as well, right? So the sense is that a lot of the scholarship is firmly focused on the dynamics of the sender, very often with good intent, you know, like that and many others critique the neoliberal model, right? Like basically, right, like, oh, bad British institutions, right? Like going out to China and, you know, Malaysia, you know, like milking these students there, right? And making money. But no, the sense is that like we need to consider as well, right? Like, I mean, the interests, the structural, the structures in the receiving country or territory, their interests, their thinking, their perceptions, their beliefs. So there's an opportunity, obviously, that's for North-South relationships, but there's also an opportunity there with that kind of thinking on both sides, not just in terms of North-South, but thinking always on any party's motives and interests. There's an opportunity to also understand South-South HE mobilities and partnerships. Yeah. Anyway, that's the paper that I've spoken a little bit about. It's a good paper, so I recommend that everyone reads it. I've also made my views known to Lucas. So a few notes on, okay, now a little bit of the findings that I did in these two and a half projects. They're based on document and policy analysis. Hopefully that will change. I'll show you that hopefully the third project, the emergent third project, the ASEAN analysis. So the disclaimer there is that it's commissioned research by the EU SHARE project. So this is the support to the ASEAN region. I've done several projects for them as their lead researchers. This is a consortium of EU kind of international ed organizations. So the British Council, which will again no longer be part, unfortunately, of this in the next cycle. Campus France, NUFIC, which is the Dutch British Council, you might say, DAAD, the German academic exchange program. And then the second project are case studies that I've done with team members on studying international partnerships, Sino-foreign partnerships. And the case studies that we looked at were the Sino-British College and the Sino-Danish Center. And this is part of ongoing work really to understand how transnational education is governed in China, and that there's an evolution of that that's still ongoing. So there have been more recent papers. This represents work that was done about 5 years ago now, and some newer work. There's a paper out. I had a paper out with one of my colleagues in 2021, but this is from a paper that was a little bit earlier than that, maybe 18 or 19. So first of all, so the first study was really, EU share. So the EU asked us, basically, the EU is trying to understand how ASEAN can function as a regional higher education space, much like Bologna and the European higher education space. And so they're trying to understand different aspects of what they already know in Europe and trying to understand those features in the Southeast Asian region, right? So Southeast Asia, there's a umbrella organization for Southeast Asia called the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So sometimes they're used interchangeably, ASEAN nations and SEA, Southeast Asia, which refer to the 10 countries, soon to be 11. There's a political accord to include Timor-Leste in this group, but the 10 countries, it's easy to, well, you'll see a chart later with all of the countries named. So there's work on the EU Share project is supporting work on, say, credit transfer, quality assurance mechanisms throughout the region, scholarships. But what we were tasked to look at was intra-regional mobility and its effect on employment, right? So, which is another way of saying, are there any good effects of intra-regional higher education mobility, right? This is something that Europeans have studied or know a little bit about. The Erasmus program is circulating Europeans all throughout Europe. Obviously, I believe that's a political project, but there are some other quote-unquote identified benefits. If you use a kind of human capital model, is increased employability of Europeans who do their Erasmus experiences abroad, right? French persons who go to, say, Italy, right? They say that, okay, if you both qualitative and quantitative data show that they become more employable, not just in Italy or France, but in other parts of the European Union. So the idea was, does not exist in ASEAN, or do those effects exist in ASEAN? Yes, but so the short answer is yes, but we're not sure whether it's because of the mobility per se, but just the value of the signaling effect to be chosen, because most of this mobility, as we will see, is actually scholarship mobility, because despite the fact that there's been a very large increase in the number of ASEAN nationals who study in other ASEAN countries, the proportion is very much that ASEAN nationals, when they have an international student experience, go outside the region. So more than 90% leave the region, and the top destinations are Japan, the United States, Australia, and Japan, in that order. So those are the top destination countries for ASEAN. So as I said, more than 90% of ASEAN students who go abroad for some period of study go outside the region. And the ones who remain in the region are mostly supported by scholarships, right? So the marketized side of international student mobility in ASEAN is all ex-ASEAN, extra-ASEAN mobility. And intra-ASEAN mobility is largely government or trust-supported, financial charity, or policy-supported mobility, right? In which case, there's a process of applying for that mobility, and that signaling effect of succeeding in getting that scholarship is what I would argue, because it's a qualitative study, but this is what we would argue is the main reason which affects their increased employability. So in this particular study, we looked at employers and the students, right? Like we went to the graduates and asked them what they thought about their experience, what they felt was a contribution to just their lives, but also and their studies, but also in terms of their employability. And then we went to the employers as well. So we didn't do it, unfortunately, for the whole region. So we chose in 4 countries, 3 industrial areas or 3 industrial sectors, and we did the study there. But more or less, that's the finding. That it's interesting, I think, and there's some analysis there. It's not surprising that they would be more, employable. We can go a little bit deeper into that study. That's not necessarily the main focus of what I'm trying to say today. But the sense is that I think the trend here that we discovered is really ASEAN countries and institutions are really oriented outwards, outside the region. UU's research also shows that her interviews with university leaders in East and Southeast Asia show the difference, show that Southeast Asian university leaders prefer to partner or think about international partnerships with Western institutions, which is an interesting contrast to some of her other data, which shows that East Asian, meaning China, Korea, well, she can tell us more about that, Japan, when they think of internationalization, they think more about regional partners. They think about, they're more open to partnering with ASEAN countries or others, whereas ASEAN countries are always oriented towards the global West, or the global North. Yeah. Let me just see if, I don't know if I'm missing that last column. Sorry, it's just to say that, oops. So
if you just click on here to reconfigure that. Or worse.
Gary, do you mind just?
One,
oh, sorry. Oh, this one. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. There we go.
Okay. Oh, there. Thanks. No, I think I missed 2 columns. But anyway, so it's just to say that. So this chart shows. Sorry about for those who are slightly further away from the screen. But this shows the flows of international student mobility. It also shows actually the quality of data. So obviously, to get a comparable data set, this is from UAS, UNESCO Institute of Statistics. So maybe Emma can tell her colleagues that in Southeast Asia, it's baffling to me why we actually don't have the figures for Cambodia, the Philippines, and Singapore, particularly Singapore, or even the Philippines, where I'm from. I mean, I don't think they're that bad. I think if our colleagues, for instance, in Laos and Vietnam can generate this data, I think we should be able to, there must be some sort of record of this international student mobility data. So with that caveat in place, meaning we don't have data for Cambodia, the Philippines, and Singapore, 3 of the 10 ASEAN countries, the others being Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. So the corridors are Indonesia to Malaysia, and Malaysia and the other direction, although there's much more movement of students from Indonesia to Malaysia. There's a little bit of movement from Malaysia to Indonesia. So some of our respondents said that, okay, there are these cultural affinities and lower language barriers in those cases. So to an extent, Bahasa Indonesia and Bahasa Melayu are a little bit, that they can understand each other to a certain extent. And the other main corridors are the CMLV countries. So this is, I would say, the less developed countries of the Mekong region, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, to Thailand, which is the, I think, most the richest country in the Mekong Delta region, right? So that corridor is there from the CMLV countries to Thailand. And there's also a corridor from Laos to its next door neighbor, Vietnam. And again, that also represents differences in development between Laos and Vietnam. So really the questions for this are these mobility patterns fixed? Is it possible to increase the proportion of intra-ASEAN students among the total of all ASEAN students? In other words, the question really is that, can we imagine a world in which Southeast Asia doesn't automatically look, Southeast Asian students and or university leaders or faculty members don't automatically look to the global North or global West for their partners? That's basically what this is saying. There are other things there, that could be unpacked. But like this, in a way, it's like a context for saying that, well, okay, in this particular region of the global south, they've been conditioned. There are lots of issues about coloniality, among other discourses. That structure, right? The international partnerships of this region, and in a way, the question is, well, the ones that you have in front of you, but the work that the EU is doing. So taking a step back from the project itself, but thinking about the commissioning of the project, does the EU or Global North institutions, is there some potential role for them in fostering or changing the pattern of these partnerships, of facilitating South-South, in this case, student mobilities? Most of those numbers that you saw, intra-regional mobility, are facilitated by the European Union. So the European Union is basically giving seed corn money for at least this is my reading, of a proto-Erasmus in ASEAN. So I don't have time to go through that, but they put in some funds to facilitate this mobility. I'm involved in another project that will start in the next kind of budget round to understand the dynamics of this intra-regional mobility via scholarships. ASEAN has no money, the Secretariat, right? The EU counterpart, because they're very different organizations. The ASEAN Secretariat doesn't have money for this. There is money in the region, but it is not in the ASEAN Secretariat. So the question is how to mobilize the pots of money that exist. Anyway, that's another question. But the bigger point is not, does the EU, can it play, or should it play, or how can it play a role in changing the dynamics of partnerships in the ASEAN region, particularly, in my view, to foment regional, intra-regional partnerships as a form, as an example, as one kind of South-South partnership. Okay, the second project, so slightly different, like perspective or slightly different data, is about the governance of transnational higher education in China. So like the different project, as I said, right, like China, different country, obviously not ASEAN, and here again, as I said, it's an inelegant story. So the study is about institutions, not about like government to government partnerships, but about the governance of institutional partnerships. So the level of analysis is about partnerships, institutional partnerships. Here's an example of, I would say, the archetypal institution. This is a picture of the Nottingham University of Nottingham campus in Ningbo in China. And here you can see a recreation actually of the administrative building of Nottingham, right? Like Nottingham has this, obviously Nottingham has this old, like clock tower building, very iconic. And it's been recreated without this river that flows in front of it in Nottingham, UK. But the building itself has been recreated in China. Whereas on the right side here, you have, you cross this oval and you have Chinese style, or quote unquote Chinese what you would normally see as a Chinese residential building, which serve as the dormitories, right? And this kind of architectural difference exists throughout the campus. So here you have like an East and West partnership, even physically represented in the on the Chinese campus. So TNH in China, I mean, there's obviously lots of literature in this. Like they've done it and continue to do it as a way to globalize its HE sector. But obviously, we're in a very, very different world, even from this particular study that was published in 2013. It was seen as a way, and this is an even older study, of boosting accessibility to HE and accessing knowledge and educational resources in the global north, right? And that's an even older study in 2008. Obviously, this has moved on, which we'll talk about a little bit. But the idea was that bringing Chinese and foreign partnerships together would produce or would result in mutually beneficial results. There are three distinct types. There's Chinese foreign cooperation universities. These are standalone organizations. This requires the greatest commitment from both partners. There are institutes affiliated to Chinese universities, variety of places, but at least numerically, these most often happen in quote unquote second tier colleges or universities. And then there are finally, like I would say, like the smallest scale partnerships are individual programs affiliated to Chinese universities. Yeah. And you have basically that level of commitment is represented in the number of those partnerships that you find. So you have these 9 standalone universities, and then you increase to over 1,000 of these kind of more smaller scale program to program partnerships. Yeah. And then they're governed, right? Like there's a policy in China that basically governs how these things work, right? It's called the CFCRS, the policies on running foreign schools in China. And I've just decided to so when I say that this, well, it's true in China, but it's true in many other places, but particularly in China. So many of you are, especially in the room, are familiar with the governmental regimes there. There's many people have already argued and described its policies, developmental state policies, meaning that, you know, like national development is embedded in its governance policies for a range of sectors, particularly those that involve foreign partnerships. So here are some quotes from this particular set of policies. So that the policy imposes strict controls over these schools, over these partnerships, and the disciplines of business management and other disciplines that China's tried to curb. So basically, these are the cash cow disciplines, the idea that we should have less of these cash cow partnerships where there's not much knowledge transfer from the external partner, from the foreign partner, and a transfer of financial resources outside of China, from China to the foreign partner. The idea is to impose strict control over the entry of foreign resources, and particularly to protect China's educational sovereignty. This have to do with management decisions, who's on the board, what's on the curriculum. So apart from that control, there's also this sense of like, oh, the foreign partner needs to put in a minimum, quote unquote, investment. So there's the 4 1/3 kind of in the indices, right? That the foreign partner needs to contribute at least 1/3 from its side of the teaching hours, the teachers. So 1/3 of the teachers need to be, quote unquote, foreign, 1/3 of the courses, 1/3 of the aspects of the curriculum as a whole. So, and this was placed there to, the spirit of this is to maintain a minimum level of knowledge transfer, yeah, from the foreign partner. And this is interesting, especially this, I would say, this quantification of it, that, okay, like 33% is the minimum, right? For any partnership to exist, at least 33% should be coming from the foreign partner. So obviously, like, it can't be more than 50% because China needs to have this educational sovereignty and overall control. But on the other hand, there needs to be at least 33% from the foreign partner. Anyway, so using that lens, I mean, we'd studied like 2 archetypes of partnerships, the Sino-British College. These are the kind of mostly Northern England institutions that are part of this partnership with the, I'd forgotten the full name of the Shanghai institution, but it's based in Shanghai, quote unquote, traditional, oriented towards student mobility. So as I said, it's mostly about student mobility and about revenue generation, which reflects the variety of capitalism that Lucas Graf showed in his earlier paper that I alluded to, that refers to a more market-oriented partnership, where the partnership is formulated on the basis of a market relationship, right? Like, okay, like pit for that, or here, right? Like, I mean, the people get this degree, they pay money, and then this is what they get. And then more interestingly, perhaps, because that's a model that I think we mostly know about, right? Like, I mean, the British model is that, oh, you go here, you get the degree, you pay for it, and that's it, right? Like, that's how it works. Both parties are happy because the Chinese party, both the local Chinese partner makes money, you know, like running, I mean, there's some profit involved. The Chinese student gets a qualification that is valuable, that they perceive to be valuable for themselves, particularly in their own labor market, although that's changing. And then the British partner gets money as well, right? Like via the tuition fees. That's a relatively well-known model. So the Sino-Danish Center, by contrast, is a political partnership. So Denmark has only 8 universities. I mean, it has a lot of higher education institutions, but it only has 8 universities, right? They're all publicly funded. They're all public institutions. Speaking of this continuum of the varieties of capitalism, you might see the Danish model as on the opposite end of the British model. So these are these 8 universities. Their kind of signets are all on this particular slide. And their partnership in China is with the University of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is a very special kind of university in China, that basically the University of the Academy the University of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So this is a very special organization in China, and it was chosen specifically, that nature, the nature of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the University of the Chinese Academy of Social Science was chosen for this partnership because the nature of this partnership is political and comprehensive. So it's basically all of Denmark, all the entire scientific infrastructure of Denmark, partnering with a representative of the entire scientific infrastructure of China. This partnership has relatively few students involved. So it is more of each one of these partners is in charge of a particular scientific area. So just to Copenhagen Business School, for instance, is in charge of the social sciences area of the partnership. IT University of Copenhagen is in charge of the computer science side. SDU, certain partners are in charge of water. That's a particular strength of one of the Danish universities. And so that's how they organize this particular partnership. This graph represents the kind of governance structure of this particular partnership. And I guess just the main takeaway from this slide is really the sense that this partnership has in its foundational documents, if you read kind of these constitutional documents, a commitment to what's clearly stated as a 50-50 policy. So again, with reference to that term of partnerships, right? It's not just 1/3 that it's providing, right? But that everything in this partnership needs to be quote unquote 50-50. So using the metaphor language I've chosen for this talk, an equal partnership, at least numerically, right? There's a lot of political investment involved. So this is the Danish Queen, Margrethe, who came to China to, put shovel in the ground I think this was to put the shovel in the ground, not the ribbon cutting. There's the symbolic orientation and non-commercial orientation of this particular partnership, which happens at the very highest political levels, right? So you can probably see the difference of this with the British example. And this model represents, well, one reading is that China wants more of this kind of model where it's not necessarily students aren't necessarily being used as cash cows. There's quote unquote more knowledge transfer. Obviously, there's a size difference in terms of the economies of Denmark and China, and so our argument, or one of our arguments, is that this potentially reflects a different model that represents a bigger win for China. But it doesn't mean that the Danes don't get anything out of this partnership. But the sense is that there is a sense of mutual benefit that's not so transactional, but it's a different form of benefit that each party receives in that form of partnership. And that kind of partnership means that China is closing down other forms of partnerships. So in 2018, this, the people who run the regulators, basically, the CIHE regulators, closed down 234 partnerships, and they approved some, mostly with Belt and Road countries, again. So either with the main sending countries, the United States, the UK, and Australia, so kind of the strong science countries, quote unquote, strong science countries, or Belt and Road countries, right? So these were they opened a few of those and they closed down many, many others, right? So this shift towards either areas where China still feels that there's something to quote unquote learn from the US, the UK, or whatever, or partnerships of political importance to China. In other words, at least at that point, which continues to be the Belt and Road countries. So the question then that this kind of research or these kind of findings raise are, should CIHE move from a market model to a more political model to achieve this kind of equality, or is it a different form of equality or equal partnership? And yeah, should CIHE then, should our understanding of CIHE move from student flows? That's why I think I felt to de-emphasize the student mobility to thinking about resource flows, right? And yeah, I mean, I don't think they're the same. So at least it broadens our vocabulary of thinking about equality and how to think about them. Well, and finally, this is the study that we haven't done. but I was inspired because I met some people over in Boston who are doing a kind of content analysis of this EU partnership, right? Like of the policy documents of the EU. And I'm hoping to do like more qualitative research, not just policy research on kind of this EU in ASEAN. I've spoken a little bit about it already at the end of the like earlier findings, but the sense of, and comparing, maybe this is potentially something that some of you might know a thing or two about, right? Like how external partners, for instance, are working in spaces like ASEAN. Sorry, then now we're jumping back again to this other bit, right? Like, I mean, the Americans partner with ASEAN in a certain way, the Chinese do as well. I'm not as familiar with Canada and its particular strategy and how it works with the bloc as a region. Here are some of the resources that I've drawn upon for these things that I've shared with you today. Thank you very much. And just to help us, I mean, well, I have some of these things. These are my questions to you, but I guess the question is whether you have any questions for me.